The ad had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases were starting to tear through the ink, but Evelyn Harper had it memorized by now anyway. Housekeeper wanted. Remote property. Room and board included. Immediate start. Inquire at Mercer Ranch. Ridgeline County. That was all. No telephone number. No description of duties. No mention of pay beyond the vague promise of a roof and meals. Any sensible woman would have thrown the scrap of paper away. Evelyn had read it on a Tuesday evening in the back corner of a boarding house in Caldwell, sitting on a cot that sagged in the middle and listening to the rain come through a crack above the window. And by Wednesday morning, she had packed her single trunk and asked the station master which direction was east toward the ridge country. She wasn't running from anything, exactly. She told herself that the whole ride out on the supply wagon she'd hitched with a feed merchant named Aldous, who talked about corn prices for 4 hours straight without seeming to require any response from her. She wasn't running, she was just moving. There was a difference. Her mother had died in March, and the small apartment above the dry goods store where they had lived together for 6 years had been rented to a new family before the ground had properly settled over the grave, because that was how things worked when you were a tenant and not an owner, and Evelyn had understood that without bitterness. She had packed her trunk, paid her respects at the grave with a handful of wild clover because she couldn't afford cut flowers, and walked out of Caldwell with the folded advertisement in her coat pocket. She was 26 years old. She had $12.40. She was not, she kept telling herself, desperate. She was something close to it, but not quite. Aldous dropped her at the base of a rutted track that split off from the main road and disappeared uphill into a stand of cottonwoods. He pointed with his chin and said, "Mercer Place is about a mile up that way. Can't miss it." "Well, you can miss it if you're not paying attention, but there ain't much else up there to confuse it with." He flicked the reins and was gone before she could thank him properly. Evelyn stood in the road with her trunk beside her and looked up the track. The afternoon light was going thin and golden the way it did in late October out here, where the sky was enormous and the land rolled in long brown waves toward distant hills. It was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. She picked up one end of her trunk and began dragging it up the hill. By the time the ranch came into view, she was sweating through her coat despite the cold, and her right hand had a blister forming where the trunk's leather handle had rubbed. She stopped and looked at the place properly. It was not what she'd pictured. She'd pictured something tired but functional. A weathered farmhouse with a kitchen garden gone to seed for winter, a barn with a few gaps in the siding, the kind of property that needed a firm hand and a regular schedule and would respond to those things in kind. What she was looking at was something that had passed tired some time ago and was now somewhere between struggling and surrendering. The main house was a 2-story clapboard structure that had been white once, a long time ago, and was now the gray of old dishwater. 2 of the porch railings were broken. A shutter on an upper window hung at an angle. One hinge failed, and it turned slightly in the breeze with a sound she could hear even from this distance. The yard between the house and the barn was churned mud and straw, and the kind of general disorder that comes not from one bad week, but from many months of a place being worked without being tended. There was a fence along the south side of the property missing every 3rd post. A dog appeared from somewhere behind the barn, a big yellow animal with a gray muzzle, and regarded her without barking, just watched her, tail low. Evelyn looked at her blister. She looked at the ranch. She looked at the $12.40 worth of choices available to her in the world. She picked up her trunk and kept walking. She knocked at the front door and waited. Nothing. Knocked again. From somewhere inside came a sound, choking, not footsteps, more like something being knocked over, a muffled voice, and then silence. She tried the door and it opened. "Hello?" she called into the dim interior. "My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm here about the housekeeping position. Bucky." The hallway she stepped into was dark and smelled of wood smoke and something underneath that, the particular smell of a house where no one had been cleaning properly, where meals got made and dishes sat, where wet things dried in piles and dry things accumulated dust. It wasn't a filthy house. It was a neglected one, which was different and in some ways harder to address because neglect didn't announce itself the same way. It settled. A face appeared at the far end of the hall. A child. A girl, Evelyn guessed, about 12 or 13, with dark braids that needed redoing and a wariness in her eyes that was older than 12 or 13. She wore a flour sack apron over her dress, and she was holding a wooden spoon as though she'd been interrupted mid-task. "Paws out," the girl said. "I see. I'm Evelyn Harper. I wrote about the housekeeping position. I know who you are. He told us you might be coming." The girl didn't move from the far end of the hall. "I'm Ada. Ada, nice to meet you. He's out at the south pasture. He'll be back before supper." A pause. "You can wait in the kitchen if you want. I'm making biscuits." The kitchen was warmer than the hall and better lit, and it told Evelyn more about the household than anything else she'd seen so far. Ada was clearly doing her best. The biscuit dough was properly worked. The stove was blacked and functional, but the counters held a week's worth of dishes waiting to be properly washed, and the window above the sink had a crack in the glass that had been patched with a strip of oilcloth and was letting in a steady draft. And there was a chair at the kitchen table with a broken leg propped on a folded piece of wood that was one careless nudge from collapsing. 3 other children appeared in stages over the next 10 minutes. A boy of about 10, serious-faced and measuring her with the particular assessment of a child who has had to learn to read adults quickly, who introduced himself as Henry. A girl of maybe 8, named Clara, who came to stand in the kitchen doorway and stare without saying anything at all. And then, last, a small figure that Evelyn almost missed because he came in so quietly and went directly to the corner near the stove and sat on the floor with his knees pulled up. He was the smallest, 4, maybe 5 years old. He had dark hair that stuck up at the back, and he didn't look at her, just sat in his corner with his arms around his knees, watching the floor. "That's Samuel," Ada said, not looking up from her biscuits. "He doesn't talk much." "How much is much?" Ada was quiet a beat too long. "He used to talk more." Evelyn looked at Samuel in his corner. He hadn't moved. She didn't try to speak to him or approach him, just let him be where he was, and after a moment she turned back to Ada and asked if she could help with the biscuits. Silas Mercer came in through the back door at 5:30 with mud on his boots and something in his face that Evelyn recognized. Not grief exactly, not anymore, but what grief leaves behind when it's been living in a person long enough to stop being acute and start being structural. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, probably 40 or close to it, with the kind of weathered look that came from working outdoors in all conditions for 20 years. He stopped when he saw her sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee Ada had poured, and for a moment he looked like a man who had forgotten he'd sent for someone. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Mercer." He looked at his boots. "I should get these off before—" "The floor's already dirty," Evelyn said, not unkindly. "Come sit down." He sat. Ada set a cup of coffee in front of him with the practiced ease of a child who has been doing adult things for long enough that they no longer feel remarkable. And that simple motion, a 12-year-old pouring her father's coffee with the weary competence of a much older person, told Evelyn more about this household than an hour of conversation would have. "I appreciate you making the trip out," Silas said. He wrapped his hands around the cup. His hands were badly calloused, and there was a healing cut across the knuckles of his right hand that hadn't been properly cleaned. The ad was, "I kept it simple." "It was very simple," Evelyn agreed. Something moved across his face. "I wasn't sure what to say." The truth is usually a good place to start. He looked at her then, properly, for the first time. His eyes were dark gray, the color of rain on slate, and there was in them the caution of a man who has been disappointed enough times to approach most things sideways. "The truth," he said slowly, "is that I need more than a housekeeper." The kitchen was quiet. From the front room came the sound of Henry and Clara arguing in low voices over something, the normal small friction of children in close quarters. Samuel had not moved from his corner. "I figured that out already," Evelyn said. Silas exhaled. It wasn't quite a sigh, more like the sound of a man setting something down that he'd been carrying for a while. "My wife passed 18 months ago, February. It was fast. She was sick for 6 weeks, and then she was gone. And I've been trying to keep everything running since then, and He stopped, looked at his coffee. "Ada's been doing more than a 12-year-old ought to. Henry's been taking on work in the yard that belongs to a grown man. I've been failing them." The last sentence came out flat and matter-of-fact, like a thing he'd said to himself enough times that the feeling had gone out of it, which made it worse somehow. I need someone who can manage the house and help with the children. I need... He stopped again. I put housekeeper in the ad because I didn't know how to write what I actually needed. The fire in the stove ticked. Ada was pretending to be very busy at the counter. You misrepresented the position, Evelyn said. I did. I could have turned around at the road. You could have. She looked at Samuel in his corner. He had fallen asleep sitting up, his head dropped forward, still in his coat and boots. Nobody had noticed, or maybe everyone had noticed, and nobody had enough to spare to go pick him up. She looked at the broken chair propped on its folded wood shim. She looked at Ada's stiff, careful back at the counter, the girl listening to every word while pretending hard not to. 1 week, Evelyn said. Silas looked up. I'll stay 1 week. We'll see how it goes. She pushed back from the table and went to Samuel's corner, crouching down beside him. He was solidly asleep, weight heavy the way small children get, and she lifted him carefully. He was heavier than she expected and made a small sound without waking. She straightened with him against her shoulder. Where does he sleep? Silas stood up fast, reaching out. I'll take him. I've got him. Where does he sleep? A beat of something that might have been pride or might have been the particular male difficulty of accepting help. Then, top of the stairs, second door on the left. I'll... Sit down, Mr. Mercer. Finish your coffee. She carried Samuel up the stairs. The second door on the left opened into a small room with 2 beds, Samuel's and presumably Henry's, and she laid him down on the near one and worked off his boots and pulled the quilt up over him without waking him. He rolled onto his side and tucked his hands under his cheek. In sleep, his face had none of the careful, closed-off quality it had when he was awake. He just looked like a very small child. She stood in the doorway for a moment. 1 week, she told herself, that's all. The first morning she was up before the sun. She had slept in the small room off the kitchen that had apparently been used for storage until Silas had cleared it out enough to fit a cot. She could tell from the boxes still pushed against one wall and the hook on the back of the door that had old aprons hanging from it, and the way the room still smelled faintly of dried herbs and old paper. She didn't mind any of it. She had slept in worse. She built up the kitchen fire and put water on and took stock of the pantry, which was a project in itself. There was food. Silas had not been letting them starve, but it was the pantry of a household without a plan. Things purchased without reference to each other. A large quantity of dried beans, a smaller than expected quantity of flour, no cornmeal at all, and a ham that was going to need to be dealt with soon. The icebox had a saddle of mutton and a crock of butter and 3 eggs, which was not enough eggs for a household of 6. She made a list. Ada came down at 6:30 and stopped in the kitchen doorway, looking surprised. You're up, she said. Couldn't sleep. Evelyn handed her a cup of coffee, which Ada accepted with the automatic gratitude of someone who had been waking up to cold kitchens for a while. Do you have chickens? We did. We have 6 left. They're in the coop behind the barn. They lay some, but not a lot, not in this cold. Where's the feed? In the lean-to, but we're low on it. Evelyn added chicken feed to her list. Does your father have a regular trading relationship anywhere in town? Haverford General Store. Mr. Klein keeps a tab for us. Good. What does Henry do in the mornings before school? He splits wood and checks the stock. A pause. He doesn't always get to school. Sometimes things come up. How often is sometimes? Ada looked at her coffee. Maybe twice a week he gets there. Evelyn wrote that down too, though it wasn't a supply item. Henry appeared at 7, already in his work coat, and regarded Evelyn the way he'd regarded her the night before. Watchful, neutral, reserving judgment. He was a good-looking boy with his father's broad forehead and the particular gravity of a child who has been the man of something for too long. Morning, he said. Morning. Henry, after you split wood, come back inside before you go to the barn. I'll have breakfast ready and I want you to eat before you do the stock. He blinked. I usually do the stock first. I know, but eating first means you'll do the stock better, and it means I can see you before you go off and I know everyone's accounted for, okay? He considered this with the seriousness of someone being presented with a proposed change to a load-bearing system. Then, okay. He went out. Evelyn started biscuits. Silas came down at 7:30 looking like a man who had not slept particularly well and was trying not to let that show. He stopped when he smelled coffee and biscuits and the particular warm smell of a morning kitchen that was functioning properly, and something crossed his face that he covered quickly. "You didn't have to," he started. "Sit down," Evelyn said, same as the night before. "Biscuits are almost done. There's coffee on the back of the stove." He poured his own coffee and sat and watched her move around the kitchen, and she could feel him watching, but chose not to address it. There was something he wanted to say, and he was working up to it. She had learned from 26 years of being a person that some things needed their own time. "The pantry situation," he said finally. "I made a list." He looked surprised. "Already?" "We need eggs, cornmeal, and that ham needs to be worked on today or we'll lose it. You're also low on lamp oil, and the feed situation for the chickens needs to be addressed, which may explain why your laying count is down." She set the biscuits on the table and went to the stove for the pan of scrambled eggs she'd made from what was left. "Is there a cellar?" "Root cellar, yes, off the south side of the house. I'll need to see it after breakfast." He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not hostile, more like a man seeing something he hadn't expected and not yet sure what to do with the surprise. "Miss Harper," he said. "Evelyn." "Evelyn." He said it like he was testing the word. "I want to be clear about something. I appreciate you being here, and I know you said 1 week, and I'm not—" He stopped, picked up his coffee. "I'm not going to pressure you about anything beyond that. I know the situation isn't what you agreed to." "No," she said, "it isn't." "I'm sorry for that." She looked at him. He was being honest, which she respected, and he was sitting at his own kitchen table looking like a man who had learned to apologize by practicing on a wall because there was no one left to apologize to, which was its own kind of sad. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just be useful." He blinked. "After breakfast," she said, "I need you to fix that shutter on the upstairs window before the next wind rips it off entirely, and then I need you to put a proper leg on that kitchen chair before one of the children sits on it wrong and gets hurt. Can you do that?" He stared at her for a moment. Then slowly something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. The ghost of an expression that had been dormant long enough to have forgotten how to arrive fully formed. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." Clara was the hardest. Ada had installed herself as Evelyn's shadow within 2 days. Practical, competent, slightly proprietary about the kitchen, and deeply hungry for adult female company in a way she was too proud to show directly. Henry came around more slowly but decisively, the way serious children do. Once he decided Evelyn was worth his confidence, he gave it without reserve, appearing at her elbow with questions about everything from livestock management to whether she thought it was worth repairing the broken fence along the south pasture or whether they should just abandon that grazing section for the winter. Clara watched from doorways. She was 8 years old and had the kind of quiet that wasn't shyness exactly. It was more like a child who had decided to reduce her own exposure, to take up less space, to want less, because wanting things and then losing them was a particular kind of pain she had decided she was done with. Evelyn recognized it because she had done something similar herself after her mother got sick, and she knew better than to address it directly. She didn't try to draw Clara out. She didn't make special overtures or soften her voice around her the way adults sometimes did with grieving children, which children always detected immediately and which only made them feel like specimens. She just let Clara be where she was, and she talked to Henry and Ada the same way she always talked, and she did her work, and she waited. On the 4th day, Evelyn was mending a tear in one of Samuel's coats, sitting by the front window in the afternoon light, because the parlor window faced west and caught the best light at that hour. She heard Clara come into the room, but didn't look up. The silence stretched for several minutes. Then, "That's not how you do that stitch." Evelyn looked up. Clara was standing 3 feet away, arms crossed, eyes on the coat in Evelyn's lap. "No? Mama used to do it different. If you do it that way, it pulls when you move and it comes loose again." "Can you show me?" Clara looked at her. Then she crossed to the chair Evelyn had pulled up beside the window, sat down in it, and held out her hand for the coat and the needle. Her stitches were small and even, a child taught properly by someone who took such things seriously, and she did 2 inches of the seam without speaking. "You're right," Evelyn said. That's better. Clara handed back the coat and needle. She sat for a moment longer, not quite meeting Evelyn's eyes, and then she said very quietly, "She taught me." She sounds like she was good at it. She was good at a lot of things. A pause. Ada doesn't want to talk about her. She says it makes Pa sad. Does it make you sad? Clara was quiet for a long moment. Everything already makes me sad, she said, like this was simply a fact of geography, like saying the barn is to the north or the ridge is 3 miles east. If I stopped doing the things that made me sad, I'd have to stop doing everything. She got up and left the room before Evelyn could think of what to say to that, which was probably just as well, because Evelyn wasn't sure there was anything to say. She sat with the mended coat in her lap and the afternoon light going amber through the window and felt something in her chest that wasn't entirely comfortable, the sensation of caring about an outcome she hadn't intended to care about. 1 week, she reminded herself. But the week was almost up, and she hadn't started packing. Samuel was the last. She hadn't pushed him. He existed in the household the way some small animals exist in a shared space with humans. Present, observing, occasionally visible, always slightly peripheral. He ate at the table, but rarely spoke during meals. He followed his siblings, but at a remove. Ada had told her, in the careful way Ada told her most things, that Samuel had stopped talking much after their mother died, that the doctor had said it might just be shock, and it might pass, and that it had been 18 months, and it had not entirely passed, and that Silas carried this like a stone that had no name for it. On the 5th evening, Evelyn was in the kitchen after supper, washing dishes alone because she'd sent Ada to bed early on the grounds that the girl looked exhausted, which she was. The house had gone quiet. She was working through the pot from the stew she'd made, scrubbing at a stubborn patch on the bottom, and she became aware that she was not alone. Samuel was sitting under the kitchen table. He'd done this before, she'd noticed. When things got too big or too loud, he found a way to be in the room, but under something, behind something, at the edge of something. She kept washing dishes. After a few minutes, she said without looking down, "There's biscuit left from supper if you're hungry." "Nothing. I'm going to leave it on the bottom shelf of the pantry, in case anybody wants it later." She heard a slight rustling under the table. She finished the dishes and dried her hands and got the remaining 2 biscuits from the warming shelf and put them on a plate on the bottom pantry shelf, at the level a very small child could reach. Then she sat down in her chair near the stove with her mending and didn't look at him. Later, she wasn't sure how much later, she felt something near her feet. She didn't look down. She kept her eyes on her mending and waited. A small hand appeared on her knee, just resting there, not asking anything, just present. She kept her eyes on her mending. "I left those biscuits in the pantry," she said quietly, to nobody in particular. "I hope they're still there in the morning." The hand stayed where it was for a long time. What? That night, after everyone had gone to bed and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds, the tick of the cooling stove, the occasional creak of old timber, the wind working at the eaves, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with her list in front of her, the one she'd made on the first morning. She'd been crossing things off as she went. Chicken feed acquired, ham dealt with, shutter fixed, chair repaired, cornmeal from the store in Haverford where Silas had driven her in the wagon on the 3rd day, and where she had gotten her first look at the town, and the way some people in it looked at Silas Mercer, with the particular combination of sympathy and faint contempt that communities sometimes developed for a man who was struggling in ways they found both pitiable and inconvenient. She'd noticed that. She filed it. At the bottom of the list, below all the crossed-off items, she wrote, "1 week is up tomorrow." She looked at what she'd written, then she turned the paper over. On the blank side, she wrote, "Things that still need doing." The list that followed was long. The south fence, the coop roof, which had a section that wouldn't survive the winter, the window crack in the kitchen, which needed proper glazing, not oilcloth, Henry getting to school consistently, Clara getting to talk about her mother with someone who could hold the weight of it. Samuel. The way Silas stood in the doorway of whatever room Evelyn was working in sometimes, like he was checking that something was still there, like a man who kept expecting to find absence and was still adjusting to its opposite. She wrote all of it down. Then she folded both pieces of paper and put them in her coat pocket and went to bed, and she lay in the dark room that smelled of old herbs and listened to the wind and did not think about the fact that she had not once, not in 5 days in this place, thought about leaving. She stayed. She didn't announce it. She didn't sit Silas down and make a declaration about her intentions or explain her reasoning, because she wasn't entirely sure of her reasoning herself, and she had learned from experience that explaining things you didn't fully understand yet was a good way to talk yourself out of them. On the morning the week was up, she simply came downstairs before dawn, the same as every other morning, and built the fire and put water on and started biscuits. And when Ada came down at 6:30, she found Evelyn at the stove and didn't say anything about it, just poured her coffee and took her place at the counter, and that was that. Silas came down at 7:30 and poured his coffee and sat at the table and looked at her for a moment with something careful in his expression, like a man who has been holding his breath and is deciding whether it's safe yet to exhale. "You're still here," he said. "The coop roof isn't going to fix itself," she said, "and Henry missed school again yesterday." He wrapped his hands around his cup. "He was needed in the yard. There was a section of fence that—" "Henry is 10 years old," Evelyn said, not sharply but without softening it either. "The fence will be there when school lets out. He needs to be in that classroom." Silas looked at his coffee. "I know. Do you need me to drive him in, or can you?" "I can drive him in." A pause. "I'll drive them all in. Ada, too." "Good." She slid the biscuits onto the table and sat down across from him. The kitchen was quiet for a moment, with just the fire and the distant sound of Henry splitting wood out back. "I'll need to talk to you about the coop roof today. It needs proper work before the first hard frost, not just patching." He nodded. Then, "Evelyn? Thank you for staying." She looked at him. He was looking at his biscuit. He had the manner of a man who had once been reasonably good at saying things to another person and had lost the habit of it over 18 months of not having anyone to say things to, and was now relearning, badly, with the stumbling quality of a language half forgotten. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "The coop roof is going to be expensive." He almost smiled. It got most of the way there. The days found their shape the way days do when someone takes hold of them. Evelyn had no romantic notions about what she was doing. She was not rescuing anyone. She was applying the same discipline to this household that she had learned watching her mother manage their apartment above the dry goods store. The understanding that a home didn't run on love alone, but on the unglamorous maintenance of 100 small things. And that when those small things got ahead of you, they compounded. And by the time you noticed how far behind you were, the gap felt impossible. The Mercer household had a very large gap. She was just starting at one end of it. She established a schedule and held to it with the cheerful implacability of someone who has decided that a thing is going to happen and sees no particular reason to argue about it. Breakfast at 7:30. Children to school by 8:30. Silas drove them in the wagon on mornings when the weather was bad, and on good mornings they took the 2-mile walk along the Ridge Road, which Evelyn judged was good for all of them, and which Henry initially objected to and then, within a week, stopped objecting to. Evelyn had the morning hours for the heavier household work, dinner at noon if Silas came in for it, which he did more often as the weeks went on. Children home by 4, at which point Ada helped with supper and Henry did his afternoon chores and Clara did her schoolwork at the kitchen table and Samuel sat in his corner near the stove. Samuel was getting better, slowly, unevenly, in the way children heal, not in a straight line but in sudden increments with long plateaus between them. He had stopped needing to be under the table. He had started coming to stand beside Evelyn when she was working, not asking for anything, not speaking, just present in the way he'd been present that first night with his hand on her knee, as though proximity was its own form of communication. Twice she'd heard him speak to Henry. Short sentences, practical things. "Where's my other boot? Is there biscuit left?" And both times she'd kept her face neutral because she understood that making too much of it would spook him. On a Thursday morning, about 3 weeks after she'd arrived, she was in the yard feeding the chickens, and Samuel appeared at her elbow without announcement. "Can I do it?" he asked. She handed him the tin cup of feed without comment. He threw it in careful arcs, concentrating, and the hens clustered around him, and he made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was the shape of one. "They like you," Evelyn said. He looked up at her. His eyes were very dark and very serious, and also, just for a moment, not serious at all. "The spotted one is mean," he said. "She pecked Ada." I know, I've been keeping an eye on her. I named her Harriet. Evelyn looked at the spotted hen in question. That seems about right, she said. He handed her back the tin cup and went back inside, and she stood in the yard with the chickens and the pale November light and felt that thing again, that pressure in her chest that was not comfortable exactly, but that she was beginning to understand was not discomfort either. It was something closer to the sensation of a door that has been closed for a long time starting, very gradually, to open. She noticed the banker on her second trip into Haverford. Silas had driven her in to settle the tab at Klein's General Store and to pick up glazing compound for the kitchen window, and they were loading the wagon outside the store when a man came out of the land office across the street and stopped on the boardwalk and looked at them. He was well dressed for a frontier town. Not showy, but deliberate, the way certain kinds of men are deliberate about everything, so that their clothing and their posture and their manner all worked together to communicate that they had considered every detail and found it satisfactory. He was probably 55, with a face that had once been handsome and had settled into something harder. He watched Silas for a moment and then he nodded, a short controlled motion, the kind of nod that was the opposite of friendly, and Silas nodded back the same way. The man went back inside the land office. "Who is that?" Evelyn asked. Silas took the box of supplies from her and put it in the wagon bed. "Garland Finch. He owns the county bank." "And?" Silas was quiet a beat too long, "and he's held the note on the ranch for 3 years." She looked at the door the man had gone through. "How much of it?" "Enough." He climbed up to the wagon seat. "It's under control." She climbed up beside him. They were halfway out of town before she said, "Is it actually under control, or are you telling me it is because you don't want to talk about it?" He kept his eyes on the road. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was managing something internally. After a while he said, "We've missed 2 payments." "In a row?" "Yes." "How many are you allowed to miss before he moves on the property?" "The contract says 3. A pause. "The third one's due end of next month." The ridge road stretched out ahead of them, brown and winter bare, the hills pale against a low gray sky. Evelyn looked at the road and did the arithmetic and didn't like the result. "Is the payment makeable?" "If the beef prices hold and I can get the Granger cattle moved before the freeze, yes. If not," he exhaled. "I'm working on it." She didn't say anything else about it. She could see clearly enough that Silas was a man who managed things by narrowing his focus to what was immediately in front of him, which was partly what had gotten him into the current state of the ranch, but was also probably what had gotten him through 18 months with 4 children and a failing property and nobody to help him. And she wasn't going to take that coping mechanism away from him while she was still figuring out how to replace it with something better. But she thought about Garland Finch and his deliberate clothes and his short, controlled nod, and she filed that thought carefully. The children were what mattered. She kept coming back to that. Whatever else was wrong with the situation, and there was plenty, the children were the fixed point that everything else organized around, and they were doing better. Henry had been to school every day for 2 weeks running and had come home on a Tuesday with an arithmetic test marked 91 at the top in red ink, which he showed Evelyn with a studied carelessness that did not fool her for a moment. "That's excellent," she said. "It's just arithmetic," he said, already heading for the door to do his afternoon chores, but she saw him fold the paper and put it in his coat pocket instead of leaving it on the table. Ada had started talking about things beyond the immediate management of the household, about a girl at school named Louisa who had a horse she let Ada ride sometimes, about a book she was reading that had a woman in it who traveled to cities Evelyn had never heard of. Clara had started leaving her corner of the parlor more often, coming to the kitchen in the evenings to sit near the stove while Evelyn did the mending, and they had developed a comfortable parallel silence that neither of them felt the need to fill unless they wanted to. One evening Clara said, "She made apple butter every fall. Mama, we have apple trees out back, but nobody did anything with them this year." "It's too late for this year," Evelyn said. "But I can learn to make it before next fall, if you'll show me what she did." Clara looked at her lap. "I don't remember all of it." "That's okay. We'll figure out the parts you don't remember." It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing. Boss. The first sign of real trouble came on a Wednesday in late November, and it didn't come from Garland Finch directly, which was why Evelyn almost missed what it meant. She was in the yard when the county welfare officer rode up. A thin, sandy-haired man named Pruitt, who had the particular manner of a minor official who had been given a task he found personally distasteful and was trying to discharge it efficiently so he could stop thinking about it. He had a letter in his hand and he held it out to her. "Is Mr. Mercer available?" "He's at the south pasture. I'm Evelyn Harper, the housekeeper. Can I help you?" Prewitt looked uncertain. "I have a notice regarding a welfare inspection. There have been concerns raised about the condition of the children in this household." She looked at the letter. Then she looked at Prewitt. "What kind of concerns?" "Concerns regarding adequate shelter, supervision, nutritional standards, and the general fitness of the current domestic arrangement." He said it like he was reading from a form he'd memorized. "The county is required to investigate any formal complaint." "Who filed the complaint?" Prewitt looked like a man being asked to name a specific leak in a dam. "I'm not at liberty to—" "Who filed the complaint, Mr. Prewitt?" He exhaled. "The complaint was filed through the county land office." She took the letter from him. The county land office was where Garland Finch had his secondary interests. The connection was not subtle, but it was enough removed to give him cover. She read the letter. It was formal and bureaucratic and described the Mercer household in terms that were vague enough to sound concerned without being specific enough to be demonstrably false. Inadequate domestic supervision. Questions regarding the stability of the home environment. The kind of language that created an impression without making a claim. "Come inside," she said to Prewitt. "Miss Harper, I'm here to speak with Mr. Mercer is at the south pasture and won't be back until late afternoon. You're here, and I'm here, and the children will be home from school in 2 hours. Come inside and have coffee, and I'll show you the house." He came inside because there wasn't much else to do, and she showed him the house. Not apologetically, not with explanation, just walked him through each room the way you walk someone through a place you're not ashamed of. The kitchen, which was clean and well-stocked, the pantry with its organized shelves, the children's rooms, which were tidy and warm, the parlor with its mended furniture. She showed him the food stores and the wood supply, and the condition of the stove and the glazed kitchen window that had been repaired properly. She showed him everything, and then she sat him down with coffee and a plate of biscuits and waited. Prewitt ate 2 biscuits before he seemed to realize he was doing it. He looked faintly embarrassed. "The house seems—" He looked for the right word. "It seems in order." "It is," Evelyn said. "When the children get home, you can speak to them yourself if you like." Yes, I should do that." The children came home at 4 and Prewitt spoke to them, and they spoke to him with the natural unself-consciousness of children who do not have anything to hide, Ada with her competent directness, Henry with his guarded seriousness that softened when Prewitt asked him about school and he mentioned the arithmetic test, Clara, who shook Prewitt's hand and said good afternoon the way she'd been taught. Samuel sat at the kitchen table with his cup of milk and watched Prewitt with his dark, serious eyes, but didn't speak, which Prewitt noted and Evelyn explained without drama. "He's been quieter since their mother passed. His teacher says he's doing well, and his siblings look out for him." Prewitt wrote something in his notebook. By the time Silas came in from the south pasture at 5, Prewitt was getting ready to leave. He shook Silas's hand and said the house appeared to be in good order, and he would file accordingly, and he left, and Silas watched his horse go down the track and then turned to Evelyn. "What was that?" he said, very quietly. "Welfare inspection. Complaint filed through the county land office." She watched him understand it. The color in his face changed, not dramatically, but enough. His jaw set in that way it had, but this time it was different from the contained management expression she'd seen in the wagon. This was anger, the kind that comes from a particular type of violation, when someone reaches through the line that separates business disputes from your children. "He can't," Silas started. "He just did," Evelyn said, "and he might do it again. So we need to make sure that if he does, the answer is always the same." Silas looked at her. His hands were in fists at his sides, which she didn't think he was aware of. "He's trying to scare me into selling." "I know." "I'm not going to sell." "I know that too." She moved past him to start supper. "Silas, wash up and come eat. We can talk about Garland Finch after the children are in bed." He stood in the middle of the kitchen for another moment, working through it. Then he went to wash up. After supper, after the children were upstairs, They sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the coffee, and Evelyn put the notice from Prewitt on the table between them. Silas read it again, slowly, and the anger had settled into something colder and more useful. "He knows about the missed payments," Silas said. Of course he does. He's the banker. If he can make a case that the children aren't being properly cared for, then the county gets involved, and it makes the property situation more complicated, and you have less time and attention to fight on the financial front. She flattened the notice with her hand. It's a two-pronged approach. He probably can't win on either front alone, but if he can keep you fighting on both simultaneously— "How do you know this?" Silas said, not skeptically, just genuinely asking. She was quiet a moment. "My father had a land dispute when I was young. Different situation, different man, same approach. Pressure from more than one direction until you don't know which way to defend, and you make a mistake." She looked at the notice. "Prewitt will file that it's fine, but Finch will try again, some other angle. We need documentation." "Of what?" "Everything. What the children eat, when they go to school, their grades, their health, the condition of the house. All of it written down and dated." She paused. "And we need to make the third payment." Silas put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands over his face. He held that position for a moment, not collapsing, just acknowledging the weight of it. "The Granger cattle move," he said from behind his hands. "If the weather holds another 2 weeks, I can get that done and it covers the payment." "What do you need to make it happen?" He lowered his hands, looked at her. "Another set of hands for 2 days? Can you hire someone from town?" "Maybe. Roper Davis might. He owes me a favor." He rubbed the back of his neck. "And I need the south fence holding, at least the section by the creek, or the herd will split on me." "The south fence." She pulled the notice back and flipped it over and wrote "South Fence" on the back. "Henry and I can start on that tomorrow afternoon." "Evelyn, he's strong enough and he knows that section. I can hold the posts while he works the wire." She looked up. "Don't argue with me about it." He didn't argue with her about it. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was starting to know, the one that arrived when she did something that landed outside his expectations, and he hadn't yet decided what to do with it. Then he said, "I'll talk to Roper Davis in the morning." "Good." She capped the ink bottle and stood up to clear the cups. "And Silas, next time someone rides up to this property on official business, send word for me before you send them away. I need to be in the room." He frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because in a room with a county official, a woman running a household reads differently than a man defending his property. It's not fair and it's not right, and it's the way things are." She took the cups to the sink. "Use it." He was quiet behind her. Then, "You think like a strategist." "I think like someone who doesn't have a lot of resources," she said. "It's the same thing." But sad. The south fence took 3 afternoons. It was cold work. The ground was half frozen by late November, and the wire was stiff and unforgiving, and her hands ached for an hour after each session despite the gloves. Henry was a better worker than most grown men she'd seen, methodical and patient, and he didn't complain, but on the second afternoon, when they were deep in the section by the creek where the line of posts curved and the repair was fiddliest, he said without looking up from the wire, "Do you think he's going to lose the ranch?" Evelyn held the post steady. "Who told you about that?" "Nobody told me. I'm 10, not stupid." She was quiet for a moment. "I know you're not stupid." "Is he?" "No," she said. "He's not going to lose it, but it's going to take work." She paused. "More work than just the fence." Henry drove a staple into the post with 2 clean strokes. "I could quit school, help more." "You're not going to quit school." "But if it would—" "Henry." She waited until he looked at her. His face was cold-reddened and serious and 10 years old, and also older than 10 in the way that made her chest hurt a little. "Your job right now is to go to school and learn everything they'll teach you. That's what your father needs from you. Not your labor. Your future." He held her look for a moment, this boy who had been doing the arithmetic on his family's survival since he was 8 or 9. Then he went back to the wire. They finished the fence section on the 3rd afternoon, and 2 days after that, Silas made the Granger cattle move with Roper Davis and came home sunburned and aching and short-tempered in the way men get after 2 days of hard outdoor work. And he was curt at supper in a way that made Clara look at her plate and Samuel press himself further into his corner. After the children were in bed, Evelyn said to him, flat and without preamble, "You were short with them tonight." He stopped in the middle of pouring his coffee. "I was tired." "I know. And tomorrow you should tell them that." He turned to look at her. The lamp was low, and the kitchen was quiet, and he looked tired was too small a word for it. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for so long that his body had reorganized itself around the weight. "I don't know how you do it," he said, not quite bitterly, more like honesty that had run out of places to hide. "Do what?" "Stay steady. All the time. Like nothing tips you." She looked at him. "Things tip me," she said. "I'm just not tipped at this particular moment." He sat down heavily across from her. The quiet between them was different now than it had been in the early days. Less cautious, more worn in. The kind of quiet that develops in a house between two people who have been managing the same set of difficulties for long enough that they've stopped needing to narrate it. "The payment," he said. "I can make the payment now, from the Granger move." "Good. I'm going to go into Haverford tomorrow and pay it in person. I want Finch to have to look at me when he takes it." She smiled a little. "That's either very wise or completely pointless." "Might be both." He looked at his coffee. "Either way, I want to do it." "Then do it." She picked up her mending. "Take Henry with you." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because he should see it. He should see his father walk in and pay what's owed and hold his ground. That's worth more than anything I can teach him at home." Silas was quiet for a long time. The fire ticked. Somewhere upstairs, one of the children shifted in sleep. "His mother used to do that," he said finally. "Take them along when she went somewhere important. Said children learn how to be people by watching people be people." He said it the way people said things they'd been turning over in their minds for a long time, things that had been sitting in the dark waiting for an occasion to be spoken. "She sounds like she was a smart woman," Evelyn said. "She was." His voice was even. "She was the smartest person I ever knew, and she could make biscuits better than yours, and she had no patience for self-pity, including her own." He paused. "The kids got that from her, the good parts of how they are." They got some of it from you," Evelyn said. He shook his head. "Henry works the way you work," she said. "That's you. Ada organizes the way you organize. She just does it with people instead of cattle. That's you, too." He looked like he wasn't sure whether to accept this or argue with it, and settled on looking at his coffee. "Clara's going to show me how to make apple butter next fall," Evelyn said, returning to her mending. He was very still for a moment. "Ellen taught her." "I know." "She'd—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "She'd be glad about that." "I think so too," Evelyn said. The fire, the lamp, the wind at the eaves, and Silas Mercer sitting across the table from her, not quite crying and not quite not, with his coffee in his big calloused hands, making room in the space between them for the name of the woman who had been here before her and the shape of everything that name carried with it. Evelyn kept her eyes on her mending and let him have it. Garland Finch received the payment with the precise control of a man who had not expected it and was refusing to let that show. Henry, standing at his father's elbow in the bank with his hands in his coat pockets and his chin at a careful angle, watched Finch take the money and write the receipt and slide it across the counter, and watched Silas take the receipt and fold it and put it in his breast pocket without looking away from Finch's face. "That's through December," Silas said. "It is," Finch said. "January's payment will be made on time as well." Finch's face did something very small and very controlled. "Mr. Mercer, I hope you understand that my concerns about the property are not—" "Your concerns about my property," Silas said, "are noted." He put his hand on Henry's shoulder. "Come on, son." They were halfway to the door when Finch said, "The note still has provisions, Mr. Mercer, conditions beyond payment." Silas stopped but didn't turn. "I know what the note says." "I'd encourage you to review them." A long moment. Then Silas walked out. Henry was quiet on the wagon ride home for a long time. Then he said, "He doesn't like us." "No," Silas said. "He doesn't." "Why?" Because he wanted the land and he thought he'd have it by now. He flicked the reins. He was wrong. Henry looked at the road ahead, the ridge country opening out in its pale winter colors. What are the provisions? He said. The ones he mentioned. Silas was quiet a moment. Things in the contract about how the property has to be maintained, how the household has to look. Standard bank language. He paused. Not anything we can't meet. Henry seemed to be turning this over. Because of Evelyn, he said at last. What about her? The household looks different now, Henry said, simply and without editorializing. That's because of her. Silas didn't say anything. The wheels turned on the frozen track, and the wind came down off the ridge, and Henry put his hands in his pockets, and they rode home through the cold afternoon. And somewhere in the space between them, the thing that had been slowly becoming true for weeks continued, quietly and without announcement, to become more true. January came in hard. The storm that had been building off the northern ridge for 3 days finally broke on a Thursday night, and by Friday morning, the world outside the Mercer Ranch house was white and howling and entirely indifferent to the plans of anyone living in it. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window before dawn and watched the snow come sideways past the glass and made a mental list of everything that needed doing before the temperature dropped further. The stock, the coop, the woodpile, which was adequate but would need to be moved closer to the house before the drifts made the trip from the lean-to genuinely dangerous. She put the coffee on and went to wake Henry. He was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark with his work clothes half on, which told her everything about what kind of boy he was becoming. Samuel was still asleep in the other bed, one arm thrown over his face, breathing the slow, deep breath of a child who has not yet learned to wake up anxious. Stock first, she said quietly in the doorway, then the wood. Don't go out alone. Wake your father. Pa's already out there, Henry said, pulling on his second boot. I heard him go down an hour ago. She went back to the kitchen. Through the window in the gray pre-dawn, she could make out the shape of the barn lamp swinging. Silas moving between the barn and the outer fence, checking something. She watched the lamp for a moment and then went back to the stove. The morning was a controlled chaos of the kind that farms produce in bad weather. Everyone moving, everyone useful, the household running on the particular energy of people who know what needs doing and do it without having to be told. Ada managed breakfast and kept Samuel and Clara from underfoot, while Evelyn and Henry shifted the woodpile. Silas came in at 9 with ice in his beard and a cut on his forearm where a piece of fence wire had caught him when the wind took it, and he was already moving past it toward the stove before Evelyn intercepted him. Sit down, she said. The north section of fence. We'll be there when your arm is dealt with. Sit down. He sat, with the particular ungrace of a large man being told to stop moving when he wants to keep moving. She cleaned the cut. It was deep enough to need attention, but not deep enough to need anything beyond that, and wrapped it with the linen she kept in the kitchen box for exactly this kind of occasion. He watched her work with an expression she had stopped trying to interpret and had started simply accepting, the same way she accepted the weather. It's going to get worse before tonight, he said. I know. The north fence has a section that's going to go if the wind keeps up. If it goes, the cattle drift. Can you fix it in this? Not alone. She tied off the bandage. Henry? He's 12, 10. He's... Silas paused, correcting himself. He's capable, but I don't want him out in this if it gets worse. Then you wait until it levels off and you go together. She put the linen away. The cattle won't drift far in this weather. They'll bunch. You have 2 hours before it gets worse. Use them to eat something and rest, so that when it levels off, you're functional. He looked at her. I'm not asking, she said. I noticed, he said, but he stayed at the table. Chit. The storm leveled off in the early afternoon the way storms sometimes did out here. Not stopping, but pausing, gathering itself. The wind dropping to something navigable, while the sky stayed low and yellow-gray with more weather behind it. Silas went out immediately, and Henry went with him despite Evelyn's reservation, because she looked at Henry's face when Silas pulled on his coat and understood that telling him to stay behind was a fight she would lose and that would cost more than it saved. She watched them from the kitchen window as they disappeared toward the north fence line, 2 shapes in the gray-white, Silas's bulk and Henry's narrower outline beside him, and she felt something she could not entirely name. Not fear exactly, but the heightened attention of a person who has started to understand that the stakes of a situation are larger than they originally appeared. She was in this. That was the thing she kept arriving at. Whatever she had told herself in that first week about temporary arrangements and one-week trials, she was in this in the way that mattered, the way where what happened to these people happened to something inside her too. Clara came to stand beside her at the window. "They'll be okay," Clara said. She said it the way children said things they were trying to believe. "Yes," Evelyn said. "They will." They stood there together watching the gray middle distance until two shapes reappeared out of it an hour later, one of them moving differently than it should. Evelyn was out the door before she'd finished the thought. Silas had gone down in the north pasture when the fence wire gave by, not the section he'd gone to fix, but a different section 10 yards north, buried under a drift and invisible until it caught his boot and sent him into the frozen ground shoulder first. He'd hit hard. He knew something was wrong with his shoulder immediately, the particular blinding quality of that kind of pain, and he'd gotten back up because he was Silas Mercer, and that was what he did. And Henry had helped him back to the house and had not panicked, which Silas would remember later. He came in through the back door, gray-faced, and holding his left arm against his body at an angle that told Evelyn what she needed to know before he said a word. "Sit," she said. "It might just be, it's not just anything. Sit down." She worked his coat off carefully. He made one sound when she moved the arm and then went silent in the way people did when they were trying very hard not to make sounds, and examined the shoulder with her hands, which was not the same as a doctor's examination, but was not nothing either. Her mother had dislocated her shoulder twice, and Evelyn had been there both times. "It's not broken," she said, "but it's out." "Ah, I know," he said through his teeth. "I need to put it back." He looked at her. "You know how to do that." "I watched it done twice. I know the theory. That is not the most comforting thing you've ever said to me. Do you want me to drive you into Haverford in this weather, or do you want me to put it back?" He looked at the window where the storm was picking up again, the yellow-gray sky darkening towards something serious. Then he looked at her. His face was the color of old candle wax, and his jaw was set so hard she could see the muscle working in his cheek, but his eyes were steady. "Do it," he said. She did. It was not a smooth procedure. She had been honest about the theory versus practice gap. And he made a sound she would not describe and gripped the edge of the table hard enough that the wood creaked. And then the shoulder went back into place with a sensation that she felt through her hands, and he felt in dimensions she could only approximate. And he sat for a full minute with his forehead bowed and his breathing rough while she kept her hand on his back and said nothing. Henry was standing in the kitchen doorway. His face was controlled and pale, and he looked for a moment exactly like a smaller version of his father. "He's all right," Evelyn told him. "Get the blanket from the parlor." Henry got the blanket. She got Silas to the parlor and onto the settle and put the blanket over him and sent Ada to make broth and sent Henry and Clara upstairs with their school books because there was nothing useful for them to do down here, and standing around watching their father look fragile was not good for anyone. Samuel she let stay because Samuel was already sitting quietly in the corner of the parlor in a way that communicated that he was not going to move and that making him would cost more than it was worth. She sat in the chair across from Silas. He had some color back. The shoulder was going to be sore for weeks, but it was back where it belonged and he hadn't gone into shock, both of which she counted as adequate outcomes. "The north fence," he said, "will wait. If the cattle—" "Silas." She leaned forward. "The cattle can wait one afternoon. You cannot move that arm for the rest of today, and you know it. And riding out on a horse in the condition you're in would undo everything I just did and probably add something new to fix. So the cattle wait." He was quiet. Then, "You're very good at that." "At what?" "At making a person feel like an idiot for arguing without actually calling them an idiot." "I've had practice," she said. Samuel made a small sound from his corner. They both looked at him. He was watching Silas with large, dark eyes, the particular focus of a very young child assessing whether an adult is actually okay. "Papa," Samuel said. It was the first time Evelyn had heard him say the word directly to Silas's face, not in reference but in address. "I'm all right, bud," Silas said. His voice changed when he spoke to Samuel. It dropped, went softer, shed the controlled quality it had the rest of the time. Just fell down like a fool. Samuel considered this. Evelyn fixed it? She did. Samuel looked at Evelyn, then he looked back at his father. Then he went back to whatever internal processing he'd been doing, apparently satisfied. Silas looked at Evelyn across the dim parlor with the storm against the windows and the fire low in the grate, and something passed between them that was not a conversation and did not need to be. He was up and moving the next morning, which she objected to and lost, because there were things that needed doing that Henry genuinely couldn't manage alone, and that was simply the situation. She wrapped the shoulder tightly and told him what he could and couldn't do with it, and watched him not entirely follow her instructions, because that was also simply the situation. By the end of the second day after the storm, the north fence was repaired and the cattle were accounted for, and the damage to the coop roof, a section had caved under the snow weight, had been patched enough to hold until proper repair could be done in better weather. The ranch had survived the storm, barely in places, and not without cost, but it had survived. And something else had survived it too, or perhaps more accurately, something had clarified during it, the way storms sometimes clarified things, burning off the surface and leaving what was underneath visible in a way it hadn't been before. Silas had known for weeks what was underneath. He had been managing it the same way he managed the shoulder pain, by keeping it still, not moving it, hoping that stillness would resolve it in some direction that required less of him. It wasn't resolving. On a Sunday evening 2 weeks after the storm, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and Evelyn was in the kitchen with her account book, she had started keeping the household accounts, a function that had apparently been performed only sporadically before she arrived. Silas came and stood in the kitchen doorway in the way he sometimes did, checking that something was still there. "I need to say something," he said. She looked up. His face had the particular quality it got when he was done managing and had run out of ways to keep something behind the management. She closed the account book. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He looked at his hands on the table. He was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder if he'd changed his mind, and then he said, "I think you know what I'm trying to say." "I think I do," she said carefully, "but you should say it anyway." He looked up. "I don't have a lot to offer you. I want to be clear about that before anything else. This ranch is mortgaged. I've got 4 kids they're good kids, but they're a lot, and I'm not the same man I was before Ellen died. I don't know if I'll ever be exactly that again." He said it all in a flat, deliberate way, like a man listing the terms of a contract he's not sure the other party will want to sign. "But I think about you leaving, and I can't. I don't want that. And I think I know the children, they can't lose." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I don't know how to say this properly." "You're doing fine," Evelyn said. "I'm not doing fine. I'm doing it badly." He looked at her. "I'm asking if you'd consider if there's any chance that you might want to stay, not as the housekeeper, as—" He stopped again. "As your wife," Evelyn said. "Yes," he said. Flat, direct, all the air out of it. "As my wife." The fire, the lamp, the account book between them on the table. Evelyn looked at this man, his calloused hands and his gray rain eyes and the healing cut on his arm and the way he'd said, "I don't know if I'll ever be exactly that again," with the honesty of someone who had stopped pretending, and thought about what she'd come to this ranch with. $12.40 and a want ad and a trunk that sagged on one side. She'd come looking for a job and found something she didn't have a clean name for. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I'm not staying because I feel sorry for you or for the children. I want that to be clear. I know that. And I don't have expectations about what this is or what it becomes. I know the situation." "I know you know," he said. "You've always known the situation better than I have." She looked at her hands on the account book. She thought about Samuel's hand on her knee in the dark kitchen, Clara's careful stitches in Samuel's coat, Henry's folded arithmetic test in his coat pocket. Ada pouring coffee with the weary competence of someone twice her age. "Yes," she said. Silas was very still. "Yes," she said again, more certain. "I'll stay. As your wife." He exhaled slowly, like a man releasing something he'd been holding for a long time. He didn't reach for her hand or say anything romantic, which she was grateful for, because neither of them were in a place for that, and they both knew it. What he did was nod once, the same controlled nod she'd seen him give Garland Finch, but this time with something behind it that was the opposite of what had been behind it then. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Tell Henry in the morning I'd rather he hear it from you." She did not expect the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after the conversation in the kitchen, brought out from Haverford by the supply driver who handed it to Silas without comment and drove on. Silas brought it to Evelyn in the yard where she was seen to the repaired coupe section, and she could tell from the way he was holding it that he'd read it and that something had gone wrong. She took off her work gloves. The letter was from an attorney in the county seat. His name was printed at the top in precise dark lettering, Warren Lyle, Attorney at Law, Ridgeline County. Below that, in the language that attorneys used when they wanted the content to seem inevitable and official, on behalf of Mr. and Mrs. Dearborn Holt of Cheyenne, acting as representatives of the estate of the late Ellen Mercer, née Holt, we write to inform you of a formal petition for custody of the 4 minor children currently residing at Mercer Ranch, said children being Ada Mercer, Henry Mercer, Clara Mercer, and Samuel Mercer. It is the position of the Holt family that the current domestic circumstances of said children do not serve their best interests, and that a stable, prosperous household under the care of their maternal grandparents would better provide for their welfare and future. She read it twice. Silas stood beside her without speaking. "Ellen's parents," she said, "her father and stepmother, Dearborn and Margaret Holt. Dearborn has money, old money, Wyoming family, cattle and land going back 40 years. His voice was very controlled. "He and Ellen weren't close. He didn't approve of her marrying me. He didn't come to the funeral. But now he wants the children. He wants to get Ellen's children away from me," Silas said. Flat, precise, the distinction mattering. "That's what this is." She read the letter a third time. Stable, prosperous household. The language was careful, chosen to contrast with what the Holt attorney presumably intended to characterize as the opposite. The Mercer Ranch, with its mortgage and its missed payments and its welfare inspection and its recently hired housekeeper. She thought about Garland Finch and the complaint filed through the county land office, and the second letter would come in a different hand, but it was the same hand, she was suddenly quite certain of it. Finch and the Holts. 2 directions of pressure, the same intention behind both. "Did Finch know the Holts?" she said. Silas looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Finch handled the loan on Holt's Cheyenne property, 3-4 years back. He paused. "I didn't know that mattered." "It matters," she said. She handed the letter back to him and stood in the yard with the cold air on her face and thought. The Holts had money and a lawyer and a claim that would read sympathetically to a county judge who didn't know the particulars. Grandparents wanting to care for their late daughter's children, concerned about the stability of the home they were living in. It was a simple narrative, and simple narratives were hard to fight unless you had a better one. "When did you say you wanted to do this?" she said. Silas frowned. "Do what?" She looked at him. "Get married." He understood immediately. She watched him understand it, the timing of it, what it would mean legally, what it would mean to a judge evaluating the home environment of 4 children. "I wasn't going to rush you," he said carefully. "I know." She picked up her work gloves. "Rush me." "Evelyn, Silas," she turned to face him fully. "I said yes to you for my own reasons, and those reasons haven't changed. But right now, the fact of it being done matters. How long does it take to arrange in Haverford?" "A week if we can get Judge Calloway." "Then we have a week before we need to respond to this letter." She nodded at it. "And when we respond to it, I want to be Mrs. Mercer when I sign it." He held her look. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not quite what she expected, which would have been relief for calculation. It was something simpler and harder to look at directly. Gratitude of the kind that goes too deep for the word to carry properly. "I'll go to Haverford tomorrow," he said. She told Ada that evening privately, in the kitchen after supper while the younger children were occupied elsewhere. Ada was 15 now, by the count of the weeks. Her birthday had passed in December, quiet and not quite celebrated enough, a thing Evelyn had filed away and intended to address. And she was not a child in any way that a child's treatment would honor. Ada listened without interrupting. When Evelyn finished, there was a silence, and Evelyn waited in it without trying to fill it. "Did you know about the letter?" Ada said finally. "Before he asked you?" "No, he asked me before the letter came." Ada looked at her hands on the table. She was working through something. Evelyn could see the effort of it. This girl who had been the woman of the house for 18 months and had watched adults come and go and had learned very carefully not to need any of them too much. "Are you doing it because of the letter?" Ada said. Not accusatory, just needing to know. "No," Evelyn said. "I'm doing it faster because of the letter, the doing of it. That was already decided." Ada was quiet another moment. "The Holts," she said. "I remember them from when I was small. Grandfather Holt." She said the word like something that needed to be handled carefully. "He scared me. He was very loud and very certain about everything, and he scared me." "You won't go to them," Evelyn said. "I want you to hear that from me directly. That is not going to happen." Ada looked up at her. This girl who had been managing biscuits and coffee and her siblings' grief and her father's silence for a year and a half, who had installed herself as Evelyn's shadow because she was hungry for exactly this. Someone who would say that is not going to happen and mean it. "How can you be sure?" Ada said. "Because I'm going to make sure," Evelyn said. "And your father is going to make sure. And the law is going to help us if we work it right." Ada was quiet. Then she said, very quietly, "She wouldn't want them to have us. Mama, she left Cheyenne because she wanted a different life than what they had there. She chose Pa." A pause. "She chose us." "I know," Evelyn said, "and we're going to make sure that story gets told correctly." The silence held for a moment. Then Ada nodded, one short, decisive motion that was entirely her father's, and picked up the dish towel. "I'll wash," she said. "You dry." They worked side by side in the kitchen in the quiet that they had built together over months, the dishwater warm and the lamp low, and outside the winter night pressed against the windows, and inside something was being prepared for. Not with fear exactly, but with the clarity of people who know what is coming and have decided together how to meet it. Silas arranged it in 4 days. Judge Calloway was available on a Friday, and they drove into Haverford in the wagon on a cold, clear morning with all 4 children and Ada in her good dress with her dark braids properly done, and Henry with his hair combed and his jaw set in his serious way, and Clara holding Samuel's hand the entire drive. The ceremony was brief and civil and took place in Calloway's office, which smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, and Silas said the words in the level voice he used for things that mattered too much for elaboration, and Evelyn said them back, and Calloway witnessed it and shook their hands, and the children filed out into the thin winter sunshine. Samuel pulled on Evelyn's hand to get her attention, and when she crouched down to him, he looked at her face with his dark, serious eyes and said, "Are you our mama now?" She looked at him. She thought about what to say, the honest version, the careful version, the version that covered all the complexity. Then she looked at his face, which was not asking for complexity. "I'm Evelyn," she said. "Same as always. But I'm staying, for good." He considered this with the gravity he gave all important information. Then he nodded and took her hand again and walked to the wagon, apparently satisfied. Henry was beside her at the wagon wheel. He didn't say anything, which was Henry's way, but his shoulder pressed against hers briefly as he climbed up. A gesture so small it could have been accidental and was obviously not. She climbed up after him. Silas was already in the seat, the reins in his hands, and he looked at her sideways with the ghost of that expression that never quite arrived fully, and she looked back at him, and the wagon started home. 4 days later, Warren Lyle's office received a response to the custody petition. It was signed Evelyn Mercer in the firm, clean hand of a woman who had spent her whole life signing things as herself, and found that this signature sat differently on the page, heavier in the right ways, lighter in others. The response acknowledged the petition, contested every characterization of the home environment, and noted formally that the 4 Mercer children resided with both their father and his wife in a stable household, and that the family looked forward to presenting those facts to the court at whatever date the judge found suitable. She sealed it herself and gave it to the supply driver and watched him take it down the track toward Haverford, and then she went inside and started dinner, because the children would be home from school in 2 hours, and Samuel had recently developed an opinion about whether his biscuits had enough butter on them, and that, at the moment, was something she could do something about. The trial date came back as the 3rd week of February. Warren Lyle's office sent a second letter confirming the hearing before Judge Arthur Benning of the Ridgeline County Circuit Court, and Evelyn read it at the kitchen table on a Monday morning while the children were at school and Silas was in the barn, and the house was quiet enough that she could hear the letter's paper between her fingers. Judge Benning. She didn't know the name. She added it to the list of things she needed to know. The list had been growing since January. She had spent the weeks between the response letter and the trial date doing the thing she knew how to do, which was prepare. Not dramatically, not with any particular sense of her own importance in the undertaking, but with the steady, methodical attention she gave to anything that mattered. She had written down everything. The account book she'd been keeping since November became something more than a household ledger. It became a record. Dates, meals, school attendance, grades, the children's health, the condition of the house and property, the mortgage payments made on time in December and January. She had asked Henry to bring home every graded paper from school, and she had kept them in a folder in the order they arrived. She had written to the school in Haverford requesting a formal attendance record for all 3 school-aged children and the teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Aldrich, had sent back a handwritten note confirming that Ada, Henry, and Clara had missed a combined total of 4 days since November, and that all 3 were performing at or above grade level, 4 days between 3 children over 3 months. She put Mrs. Aldrich's note in the folder with the graded papers. She had also written a letter of her own to an attorney in the county seat, not Warren Lyle, who worked for the Holts, but a man named Thomas Garrett, whose name she had gotten from Klein at the general store, who said Garrett was honest and careful and had handled Ridgeline County cases before. Garrett had written back promptly, read the documents she sent him, and ridden out to the ranch on a Saturday to meet them in person. He was a compact, serious man in his late 40s with the manner of someone who had been in enough courtrooms to stop finding them impressive. He sat at the kitchen table and read through Evelyn's folder while she made coffee, and Silas sat across from him with his hands around his cup and said very little, which was the right call because Garrett was reading and didn't need to be talked at. When he finished, he set the folder down and looked at both of them. "They're going to argue instability," he said. "Missed mortgage payments, welfare complaint, the fact that you only recently remarried. They'll try to make it look like the marriage was a legal maneuver rather than a genuine domestic arrangement." "It wasn't," Silas said. "I know that. You need to be able to demonstrate it." Garrett looked at Evelyn. "How long had you been living at the ranch before the marriage?" 3 months. "And during that time you were employed as housekeeper?" "I was managing this household," Evelyn said. "There's a difference, and the distinction matters." Garrett looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "it does. Can you demonstrate the distinction?" "The account book covers everything from my 4th day here. The household accounts, the pantry, the children's schedules, the property repairs. It's all dated." She paused. "The children can speak to what the household looked like before and what it looks like now. So can people in town. Mrs. Aldrich, Klein at the general store, Roper Davis, who helped with the cattle move." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this?" "I've had time to think about it." He looked at Silas. "Your wife," he said, with the slight emphasis of a man noting something he finds professionally useful, "is going to be a significant asset in that courtroom." Silas glanced at her sideways. "I know," he said. The Holts arrived in Ridgeline County 4 days before the hearing. Evelyn knew they'd arrived because Henry came home from school on a Wednesday with a set to his jaw that had nothing to do with anything that had happened at school. He came into the kitchen and put his books down and stood at the counter for a moment with his back to her. "I saw them," he said, "in town, getting out of the coach at the hotel." "What did you do?" Evelyn asked. "Nothing. I kept walking." A pause. "Grandfather Holt looked at me." "Did he speak to you?" "No." Henry turned around. He was 12 years old and trying very hard to look like 12 was old enough for this. "He looked at me like I was something he was deciding about." Evelyn set down what she was doing and looked at him properly. "Henry, whatever happens in that courtroom, you are not something anyone gets to decide about. You understand that?" He held her look. What if they win? They're not going to win. But what if they do? She was quiet for a moment because he deserved the honest version more than the reassuring one. If they did, she said carefully, your father and I would appeal. And then appeal again. We would use every legal mechanism available to us, and we would not stop. But they are not going to win because the facts are on our side, and we have documented every one of them. Henry absorbed this. Ada cried last night, he said. She didn't want anyone to know, but I heard her. I know, Evelyn said. She had heard too. She never cries. Everyone cries sometimes. She went back to the stove. Tell her I know, and that it's all right. Don't make a thing of it. He nodded. He picked up his books and then put them down again. Evelyn. When this is over, whether we win or when we win, he almost smiled. Almost. When we win, he said, are you going to stay? She looked at him. Henry, I signed a paper in front of a judge. I don't walk away from things I've signed. He picked up his books. He didn't say anything else, but something in his shoulders changed. A degree of tension going out of them, subtle, the kind of shift you only noticed if you'd been watching someone carry something for a long time. She met Dearborn Holt once before the trial, and she had not planned to. It was Thursday, the day before the hearing, and she had gone into Haverford alone to review the final documents with Garrett at his office. She was walking back to where she'd tied the horse when a voice said behind her, Miss Harper. She turned. He was larger than she'd expected, a big man gone to heaviness in his 60s, with white hair and the bearing of someone who had been the most important person in every room he'd entered for 40 years, and had stopped noticing that he expected this. He was dressed in the kind of clothes that didn't need to announce their cost. Beside him stood a woman in her 50s, Margaret Holt, presumably, with a careful face and eyes that moved over Evelyn with the particular assessment of a woman measuring a rival she has already decided she doesn't rate highly. It's Mrs. Mercer, Evelyn said, not Miss Harper. Something moved across Dearborn Holt's face, not embarrassment, more like a man acknowledging a correction while declining to treat it as significant. Mrs. Mercer, he said, I thought it might be useful for us to speak before tomorrow. I can't speak with you about the case without my attorney present, Evelyn said. You know that. This isn't about the case. He looked at her with the measured patience of someone who had conducted a great many negotiations in his life and found most people manageable if you found the right angle. This is about Ellen's children, which is what we all want to focus on, I'd think. Then you can say what you want to say in front of Judge Benning tomorrow, Evelyn said. Good afternoon, Mr. Holt. She started to walk past him. He said, She was a good woman, Ellen. She deserved better than what she got. Evelyn stopped. She turned back slowly. Better than what she got, she said. A hard life on a failing ranch, he said. Dying young and leaving 4 children without a mother. She had options. She had a family who could have given her more. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Ada telling her she left Cheyenne because she wanted a different life, and she chose Pa, and she chose us. She thought about Silas saying she was the smartest person I ever knew. She thought about Clara's careful stitches in Samuel's coat, passed down from a woman who had mattered enough that the stitches were still there, still holding things together. Ellen chose her life, Evelyn said. She chose the ranch, and she chose Silas, and she chose those 4 children every day she was alive. You might find that inconvenient, but it's what happened. She kept her voice level. And those children are going to stand in that courtroom tomorrow, and the judge is going to see exactly what Ellen built, not what was taken from her, what she built. Margaret Holt made a small sound that might have been disapproval or might have been something else. Dearborn Holt's face did something complicated and then went back to controlled. We'll see you in court, Mrs. Mercer, he said. Yes, she said. You will. She walked to her horse and rode home and did not let herself think about the conversation until she was past the cottonwoods and on the ranch track and out of sight of anyone who might be watching, and then she let her hands shake on the reins for a 1/4 mile, which they needed to do, and then she stopped letting them. The courtroom in Ridgeline County's courthouse was smaller than its function required, and smelled of old wood and lamp oil and the accumulated weight of official proceedings conducted in insufficient space. The Holts sat on one side with Warren Lyle and a second attorney Evelyn didn't know, and the Mercers sat on the other side with Thomas Garrett, and between them was the bar, and behind the bar was Judge Arthur Benning, who was 60-something and thin and had the face of a man who had heard a great many claims in his time and reserved his conclusions. All 4 children were present. Garrett had advised it not to manipulate the judge's sympathies, he'd said precisely, but because the children's presence was itself a fact, and facts should be visible. They sat in the row behind Silas and Evelyn. Ada sat straight-backed with her hands in her lap. Henry sat beside her with his chin level. Clara was on Henry's other side, holding Samuel's hand, and Samuel sat quietly and looked at the room around him with the serious, dark attention he gave everything. Warren Lyle opened for the Holts. He was a good attorney, precise, measured, building his case in careful layers. He established the Holts standing, Ellen's parents, Margaret standing in place of Ellen's deceased mother, with a family history and financial stability that the record would demonstrate. He established the history of the Mercer Ranch, the mortgage, the missed payments, the welfare complaint, the nature of the current domestic arrangement, a housekeeper hastily married shortly after a custody petition was filed. Hastily, he said. Evelyn noted the word. He called Dearborn Holt to the stand first, and Holt performed the role of concerned grandfather with the ease of a man who had been performing roles for 60 years. He spoke about Ellen, carefully, with a practiced grief that might have been real in its origin, even if it had been shaped since into something useful. He spoke about the children, whom he described as his blood and his responsibility. He spoke about stability and opportunity and what children deserved. Garrett cross-examined him briefly and efficiently. Mr. Holt, you said you last saw the Mercer children when? Holt paused. At Ellen's funeral, February of last year. That's 18 months ago. Yes. In those 18 months, did you write to the children? A brief pause. There were communications through... Did you write to the children directly, Mr. Holt? Yes or no? No. Did you send gifts on their birthdays? My wife handled... Did any gift or correspondence reach the Mercer Ranch from your household in the 18 months between Ellen Mercer's funeral and the filing of this custody petition? The pause was long enough to be its own answer. No, Holt said. Nothing in 18 months. And yet you're asking this court to believe that your concern for these children's welfare is the primary motivation for this petition. Lyle objected. Benning sustained it on form, but the question had already done its work. The welfare officer, Pruitt, was called by the Holts as their second witness, which told Evelyn that Lyle had made a calculation about what Pruitt would say and had concluded he was safe to call. He was wrong about that calculation, and she could see the moment Lyle understood he was wrong, which was when Garrett asked Pruitt to describe the condition of the household at the time of his inspection. Pruitt was an honest man, which was both his strength and, from Lyle's perspective, his liability. He described the house as he had found it. Clean, warm, well-stocked. He described the children, healthy, appropriately supervised, engaged in school. He confirmed that he had filed his report as finding no basis for welfare concern. And the original complaint, Garrett said. Do you know who filed it? Lyle was on his feet. Objection, relevance. Your Honor, Garrett said, the origin of the complaint speaks directly to whether this proceeding was initiated in good faith or as part of a coordinated effort to pressure the Mercer family on multiple fronts simultaneously. Benning looked at him over his reading spectacles. I'll allow it. The witness will answer. Pruitt looked uncomfortable. The complaint was filed through the county land office. The signatory was... He checked his papers. A Mr. Garland Finch. The room was quiet for a moment. Benning made a note. Garrett let that sit for exactly the right amount of time before moving on. Lyle called one more witness, a woman named Mrs. Cheswick who lived outside Haverford and who described herself as a longtime acquaintance of the Holt family and who offered opinions about the Mercer household that were vague enough to be difficult to directly contest and specific enough to create an impression. She used the word chaotic twice and unstable once and mentioned, with the careful casualness of a woman who had been briefed on what to mention, that she had heard the Mercer children described as difficult. Garrett's cross-examination was short. Mrs. Cheswick, when did you last visit the Mercer Ranch? I haven't personally. Have you ever visited the Mercer Ranch? No, but I've spoken with people who... So your testimony about conditions at the Mercer Ranch is based entirely on what other people have told you. I've heard from reliable, yes or no, Mrs. Cheswick. Yes, she said, clipped. Thank you, Garrett said, and sat down. Then it was their turn. Garrett called Mrs. Aldrich first, the schoolteacher, who drove in from Haverford and sat in the witness stand with the composure of a woman accustomed to managing large groups of people and not easily flustered. She had brought her record book. She confirmed attendance. She confirmed grades. She confirmed that all 3 Mercer children had shown marked improvement over the past several months. Ada, in particular, had begun helping younger students during reading period, which Mrs. Aldrich described as her own initiative. Henry had won the county arithmetic competition for his age group in January. Clara had written an essay that Mrs. Aldrich had submitted to the county school board as an example of exceptional student work. Lyle cross-examined her and found nothing to work with, which to his credit he recognized quickly and sat down. Garrett called Roper Davis, who confirmed that the Mercer Ranch was being properly worked, that the stock was healthy, that the property had been visibly better maintained in recent months than it had been in the year following Ellen Mercer's death. He said it plainly, without editorializing, the way men like Roper Davis said things. This is what I saw. This is what it means. Take it or leave it. Then Garrett called Silas. Silas was not a natural witness. He sat in the stand like a man who would rather be anywhere else doing anything else, which was honest and also not entirely without its own value. There was nothing performed about him. Garrett walked him through the timeline of the ranch, the mortgage, and its current standing. Payments current through February, he confirmed. The welfare inspection and its resolution. The circumstances of his marriage to Evelyn. When Garrett asked him to describe the household as it currently was, Silas was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was deciding to say something true instead of something managed. It's a working ranch, he said. It's not. Nobody's going to mistake it for easy. It's hard country and it's a lot of work, and we've had difficulties. I'm not going to stand here and say otherwise. He paused. But my children are fed and schooled and cared for. They're known and they're loved in their home. That's what they have at the ranch. Another pause, shorter. I don't know what the Holts are offering them that's supposed to be better than that. Lyle's cross-examination focused on the mortgage and the missed payments and the timeline of the marriage. He was precise about it, returning to hastily without using the word, circling the implication. Silas answered in even, flat sentences and did not lose his temper, which Evelyn could see cost him something. Then Garrett said, Your Honor, I'd like to call Evelyn Mercer. She had thought about this moment. She had thought about it in the way she prepared for everything. Not by deciding what to feel, but by deciding what needed to be said and in what order, so that when the feeling arrived, as it would arrive into a structure that could hold it. She sat in the stand and looked at the room. The Holts at their table, Dearborn Holt's controlled face and Margaret Holt's careful eyes, Lyle with his papers, Benning with his reading spectacles. And behind the bar, her family. She had stopped being careful about that word sometime in the last weeks, had let it land where it needed to land. Silas with his hands clasped on the table in front of him, Ada straight-backed and watchful, Henry with his level chin, Clara holding Samuel's hand. Garrett established the basics, her background, her arrival at the ranch, the nature of her work there. Then, Mrs. Mercer, opposing counsel has characterized your marriage to Mr. Mercer as hasty and implied that it was arranged in response to the custody petition rather than as a genuine domestic commitment. How do you respond to that? The petition arrived on a Tuesday, she said. Silas had asked me to marry him 11 days before that. Can you tell the court what the basis of that decision was? She looked at her hands in her lap for a moment, then looked up. I came to that ranch with nothing. I was 26 years old and my mother had just died and I needed work. And I answered an advertisement that turned out to describe a much simpler situation than what I found when I got there. She paused. What I found was a family that was in trouble. Not because anyone in it was bad or incapable, but because one person who had been holding a great deal together was gone, and the people left behind were doing everything they could with what they had, which was a lot, by the way. I want to be clear about that. Ada had been running that kitchen for 18 months at 12 years old. Henry was doing the work of a grown man in that yard. Clara was managing her own grief with a quietness that... She stopped for a moment. Those children were not falling apart. They were holding on. There's a difference. The room was very quiet. I stayed, she said, because they were worth staying for. And because Silas Mercer is a man who works hard and keeps his word and loves his children more than he loves his own comfort, which is the most important thing I can say about him. I married him because those things were true before the Holts filed their petition, and they'll be true after this court makes its decision. Garrett said, "Can you describe the current condition of the children's lives at the ranch?" She described it the way she kept her account book, specifically with dates, with details that were checkable, what they ate, when they went to school and what they were learning, Samuel's chickens, and what he'd named the spotted hen, Henry's arithmetic competition, Clara's essay, Ada learning the biscuit method that didn't pull at the seam when you moved. She kept her voice even, and she gave the court the facts of it, because the facts were enough. She had made sure of that. Lyle's cross-examination was aggressive in a way that told her he understood his case was losing ground and was trying to recover it through pressure. "Mrs. Mercer, you arrived at this ranch as a paid employee." "I arrived in response to an advertisement, yes." "And you had no prior relationship with Mr. Mercer or his children?" "No. No relationship, no history, no established bond with these children, and yet you're asking this court to accept that in a matter of months, you've become the appropriate permanent maternal figure for—" "I'm not asking the court to accept anything about what I am to those children," Evelyn said. Her voice was still even. "I'm asking the court to look at what those children are, which is healthy and attended to and in school and known by the people around them in a community they've grown up in." She paused. "The question before this court isn't whether I'm a good enough person. The question is whether those children should be removed from the only home they've ever known and sent to live with people they haven't heard from in 18 months. Those are different questions." Lyle regrouped. "The welfare complaint was filed by a banker who holds a note on the property and has a documented financial relationship with the Holt family. That complaint was investigated and found to have no basis. The missed mortgage payments are current through this month." She reached into the folder on the table in front of her and took out a single sheet of paper and held it up. "I have the receipts." Benning leaned forward slightly. "Counsel, approach." Garrett took the receipts and entered them. Lyle looked at them and said nothing useful. "Nothing further," Lyle said. Benning recessed for 40 minutes. It was a long 40 minutes in the hallway of the courthouse, the children sitting on the bench with their coats on, and Samuel leaning against Clara's arm. Nobody talked much. Henry sat with his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. Ada sat straight and looked at the wall across from her. Silas stood near the window and looked at the street outside. Evelyn sat beside Samuel. He was quiet, which was his way, but he had one hand through her arm and she could feel the weight of him against her side. After a while he said very quietly, "Is it going to be okay?" She looked at him. This small person who had stopped talking for months and had come back, slowly and unevenly, into speech, who had named a mean hen Harriet, who had put his hand on her knee in the dark kitchen on her 5th night here. "Yes," she said. "It's going to be okay." He leaned a little more of his weight against her. The bailiff appeared at the courthouse door. "Judge is ready." They filed back in. Benning read his decision in the flat, careful voice of a man who had written it out and was going to read exactly what he'd written without editorializing. He addressed the claim of instability. The record showed a household that had faced genuine hardship and had addressed it with consistent and documented effort. He addressed the welfare complaint, found to have no basis, and the court noted with some concern the documented relationship between its originator and the petitioning family. He addressed the nature of the marriage. The timeline did not support the characterization of a hasty or strategic arrangement, and the evidence of the household's functioning predated the petition by several months. He addressed the children directly, which he did not have to do, and which told Evelyn something about what kind of judge he was. "The children of this family," he said, "have been through a significant loss, and the court does not minimize that. But the measure of a household is not the absence of hardship. It is what the people in it do in the presence of hardship. The evidence before this court indicates that the Mercer household, as it currently stands, is doing the things a household should do. The children are schooled, healthy, and engaged in their community. The property is maintained and financially current. The domestic arrangement is established and stable. He set down the paper and looked over his spectacles at the room. The petition for custody is denied in its entirety. The children will remain with their father and stepmother. This matter is closed. The gavel came down. Lyle began gathering his papers. Dearborn Holt sat very still for a moment with his controlled face doing something that was not quite anything Evelyn could name. Not grief, not exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has been very certain for a long time and has encountered the limits of that certainty. Margaret Holt was already looking toward the door. Evelyn felt Silas's hand close over hers on the table. She hadn't known it was coming, and she didn't move away from it. His hand was very large and very calloused, and it held hers with the same quality he had when he handled things that mattered to him. Carefully, without squeezing, as though aware of the difference between holding on and holding too hard. Behind them, Ada made a sound she immediately suppressed. Henry said nothing. Clara put both arms around Samuel, and he let her. The gavel had fallen. The room was already beginning to move, the way rooms did after decisions. People standing and shifting and paper shuffling and the ordinary business of the world reasserting itself over the moment that had just occurred. But for a few seconds inside all that motion, it was very still. Silas's hand over Evelyn's and the children behind them, and the winter light through the courthouse windows falling in pale bars across the floor. Then Samuel said, from behind them, in his small, serious voice, "Can we go home now?" "Yes," Evelyn said, "we can go home." They drove home from Haverford in the wagon with the winter afternoon light going gold and thin across the ridge country, and nobody said much for the first mile. That was all right. There are moments that talking diminishes, and this was one of them. The decision still settling into the bones of everyone it belonged to, too new and too important to be immediately converted into words. Samuel fell asleep against Evelyn's arm before they reached the cottonwoods. He simply leaned and went under, the way small children did, as though his body had been holding tension it didn't have a name for and had now, with the permission of safety, released it all at once. She put her arm around him and held him against her side and watched the road. Clara was the one who spoke first. She was sitting in the wagon bed behind them with Henry and Ada, and her voice came over Evelyn's shoulder, quiet and without preamble. "I want to write to Mrs. Aldrich, to thank her." "That's a good idea," Evelyn said. "I want to do it tonight." "Then we'll do it tonight." Henry said nothing. He was looking at the ridgeline, the pale hills against the darkening sky, and his face had the quality it sometimes had after something significant, not withdrawn, just processing, that serious interior work he did before he arrived at whatever conclusion he was going to arrive at. Ada was sitting with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, which was not a posture Evelyn had seen from her before. Ada generally sat like someone ready to stand up and do something. Sitting folded into herself was different, was private. Was Ada allowing herself to take up a smaller space for a few minutes because nobody needed her to be competent right now? Evelyn looked at Silas. He was watching the road with his hands easy on the reins, and some of the controlled quality had gone out of his face. Not entirely, probably not ever entirely, because that was simply how he was built, but enough that he looked like himself without the management layer on top. Tired and relieved in roughly equal measure. The cut on his arm from January had healed to a scar. His shoulder was still occasionally stiff in cold mornings, but he didn't mention it, which she had stopped fighting because some arguments with Silas Mercer were not winnable, and that was one of them. She looked at the road ahead. She thought about the woman who had stood at a boarding house window in Caldwell 8 months ago listening to rain come through a crack in the wall, with $12.40 and a folded advertisement and nothing else in particular to recommend her direction. She tried to locate that woman precisely, what she had felt, what she had been afraid of, what she had told herself she was not. She had not been desperate, she had told herself. She had just been moving. Looking back, she understood that moving and desperate were not always different things. Sometimes the moving was the desperate part, the refusal to stop, to sit with the loss, to acknowledge that something had ended. Her mother's death had left a hole in the shape of a person, and Evelyn had walked away from Caldwell in part because standing still near that hole was more than she could manage. She had needed somewhere to go more than she had needed anywhere specific to be. The ranch had been somewhere to go, and then it had become somewhere to be. She was not sure exactly when that had shifted. It hadn't been a single moment. Not the night she'd decided to stay past the first week, not the afternoon she'd worked the south fence with Henry, not the evening she'd held Silas's shoulder in place and felt it go back and heard him not make a sound. It had been an accumulation of small moments, each one unremarkable on its own, adding up to something that only became visible when you stepped back far enough to see the whole of it. The way a fence line was invisible post by post, but unmistakable when you looked at the length of it crossing the hill. Shesk. They got home as the light failed. Henry did the stock without being asked, and came in tracking mud on the kitchen floor without noticing, which Evelyn addressed without heat, and he cleaned up without argument, which was its own form of normalcy, and therefore its own form of comfort. Ada made coffee and started supper while Evelyn got Samuel awake and out of his coat, and Clara sat at the kitchen table with the good paper she'd asked for and composed her letter to Mrs. Aldrich in the careful hand she'd been developing all year. Silas came in from checking the barn at 5:30 and stood in the kitchen doorway the way he sometimes did, and this time Evelyn looked up and caught him doing it, and he didn't cover it the way he usually would have. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He came in and hung up his coat. "Just looking." She understood what he meant. She went back to the stove. Supper was venison stew from the haunch Roper Davis had brought them last week, and biscuits, and the last of the apple preserves that Evelyn and Ada had put up in November. And it was the kind of meal that was only good because of the context of it. The table with all 5 of them around it, the lamp in the center, the fire in the stove and the cold on the other side of the windows, and the day they had all just come through settling slowly into the past tense where it belonged. Samuel ate with appetite, which he had been doing more consistently over the past 2 months. He had developed a preference for extra butter on his biscuits that Evelyn had given up contesting because the child needed the calories and she was choosing her battles. He also had developed the habit of reporting whatever had happened with the chickens each day as though it were news of genuine civic importance, and tonight he reported that Harriet had pecked at the new feed trough again, and he had spoken firmly to her about it. "Did it help?" Clara asked. Samuel considered. "No," he said, "but I feel better." Henry made a sound that was approximately a laugh. Ada covered her mouth. Even Silas's face did the thing it did when it was trying not to give itself away entirely, and failing. Evelyn looked around the table at all of them, this collection of imperfect, difficult, real people who had been breaking and breaking differently and mending differently for as long as she'd known them, and felt something that she had no interest in naming because naming it would have been beside the point. It was there. That was enough. Just 2 weeks after the trial, Garland Finch's dealings with the county land office came to a more formal kind of attention. Garrett had filed a complaint with the county clerk's office regarding the welfare petition and its documented connection to Finch, and the clerk, a meticulous woman named Ora Hines, who had been in the position for 20 years and had strong opinions about the integrity of county processes, had taken the complaint seriously. Evelyn never knew exactly what Ora Hines found when she looked into the land office's complaint records. Garrett reported the outcome to them in a letter, precise and professionally understated. But the consequence was that Finch quietly withdrew from 2 county advisory boards he had held seats on, and the note on the Mercer Ranch was sold to the county's second bank at a rate that was, Garrett confirmed, standard and without predatory conditions. Silas read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning and was quiet for a long time. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer where Evelyn kept the important documents and said, "Huh." "Yes," Evelyn said. That's it?" "That's not nothing," she said. "That's his influence in the county. And his arrangement with the Holts probably looks different to both of them now that it didn't produce results." Silas looked at the drawer. "It doesn't feel like enough." "It rarely does," she said. "But it's what we have, and it's real, and it happened because you held on long enough for it to happen. That counts." He looked at her. "Ora Hines." "I wrote to her in January," Evelyn said. "I didn't know if it would come to anything. It came to something." He blinked. "You wrote to her in January." "When I was putting together the documentation for the trial, I wrote to everyone who might have useful information." She went back to the stove. I wrote 11 letters in January. Most of them didn't come to anything. That one did. There was a silence. Who are you? Silas said. Not unkindly, more like a man who kept arriving at the same question from different directions. Someone who writes letters, she said. He was quiet behind her. Then she heard the sound of him pulling on his work coat. I'll be at the north pasture until noon, he said. The fence section by the creek needs another look after last night's freeze. I'll have something hot at noon. He went out. She stood at the stove and let herself feel, briefly, the satisfaction of a thing concluded. Not perfectly, not without cost, but concluded. Finch was diminished. The Holts had gone back to Cheyenne and had not written, which was its own kind of answer. The note on the ranch was in the hands of people who had no particular interest in the land itself, which was the best arrangement a mortgaged property could hope for. The threats were done. She gave herself 30 seconds to acknowledge that, and then she went to check on the bread she had rising in the warm corner of the kitchen, because the bread didn't care about Garland Finch and needed attention regardless. Spring came to the ridge country the way it always did. Not all at once, not cleanly, but in starts and retreats. Warm days followed by cold snaps, the ground soft one week and frozen again the next. And then finally, undeniably, the slow pull of green up through the brown hills that said the season had made its decision. The cottonwoods along the track went from bare gray to the first yellow-green of new leaves, and the meadow below the south pasture filled with the kind of grass that made the cattle move toward it with the purposeful appetite of animals that have been eating dried feed for 5 months. Evelyn had been at the ranch for 7 months. She did not mark the anniversary. There was nothing particular to mark it with, and the days ran together now the way days do in a functioning household, full enough that their boundaries blurred. But she was aware of it, the way you were aware of a distance you'd traveled only once you'd arrived at the other end of it and looked back. 7 months since she'd dragged her trunk up the hill and stood in the yard looking at a white house that was no longer white with a yellow dog that watched her without barking. 7 months since Ada had been a 12-year-old girl in a flour sack apron, managing biscuits and coffee, and her father's silence and her own grief with the determined competence of someone who has decided that needing help is a luxury she can't afford. 7 months since Samuel had sat under the kitchen table and said nothing and put his small hand on her knee in the dark. The things that had changed were not the things you would have expected to change, necessarily, or not only those things. The house was different, properly maintained now, the shutter fixed and the window glazed and the fence lines holding and the coop roof rebuilt solid in March when the weather permitted. The pantry was always stocked with purpose rather than impulse. The kitchen chair had a real leg on it. These things had changed because change in those areas had been straightforward. Identify the problem, address it, move on. The other things had changed more slowly and in ways that were harder to see while they were happening. Silas laughed sometimes. Not frequently, not with the easy facility of someone who had never stopped laughing, but genuinely, when something earned it. When Samuel reported on Harriet's ongoing campaign of aggression against the feed trough. When Henry said something dry and unexpected at the supper table. When Evelyn said something that caught him off guard. It arrived without warning and disappeared just as fast. But it was real, and it was his, and it sounded like someone coming back to himself. He talked about Ellen now. Not constantly, not in a way that required anything from the people in the room, but occasionally and without the careful control he had used in those early months, when every reference to her had been a door he was managing from the outside. He might mention something she had said, or something she had done, or a quality she'd had, and the mentioning of it was no longer a wound being opened and reclosed. It was just memory, which was what it should have been all along. Memory is the normal presence of a person who had mattered and still mattered and was not here. All three of those things true at the same time. Evelyn had understood from the beginning that she was not replacing Ellen and had not tried to. She occupied a different space in the house, adjacent to what Ellen had been, overlapping in some practical ways, but her own shape, her own character, her own way of doing things. The children had understood this too eventually, each in their own time. Clara had been the one who said it most directly. On an afternoon in March when they were making apple butter together, or beginning to make apple butter, since the apples would not be ready until fall, but Clara had wanted to start assembling the equipment and reviewing the process, and Evelyn had sat with her and gone through what Clara remembered step by step. She would have liked you, Clara said, not looking up from the notes she was making in her careful hand. Mama, she would have liked that you argue with Pa. Evelyn looked at her. I don't argue with him. You do, Clara said. You just do it quietly so it doesn't look like arguing. She did that too. She paused. He's better when someone does that. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She sounds like she was a woman who knew her own mind. She was. Clara reviewed her notes. I want to add more cinnamon than her recipe said. She always said she wished she'd used more cinnamon. Then we'll use more cinnamon, Evelyn said. Clara nodded, made a note, and that was that. Ada turned 14 in April, and this time they celebrated it properly. Evelyn had planned it over 2 weeks, quietly, with help from Henry, who had the logistical mind of someone who would eventually be very good at running something. Ada's friend Louisa came out from town with her horse, which Ada got to ride for most of the afternoon. Evelyn made a cake, 2 layers, which was ambitious given the oven's temperament, and the layers were not entirely level, but they were cake. And the children decorated the table with whatever they could find that seemed festive, which resulted in an arrangement involving dried wildflowers, 3 smooth stones Samuel had selected for reasons he declined to explain, and a piece of blue ribbon Clara had been saving. They sang. Badly, collectively, without anyone caring. Ada sat at the table in front of her imperfect cake with her braids properly done and her dark, serious eyes bright in a way that she wasn't entirely controlling, and she looked around the table at all of them, Henry and Clara and Samuel and Silas and Evelyn could see her doing it, could see her taking a full accounting of the room, all its people, this particular version of her life that had not been guaranteed. Make a wish, Samuel said very seriously, as he said most things. You don't have to tell us what it is, Clara added. That's the rule. Ada looked at the candles for a moment. Then she blew them out. Later, after cake and after Louisa had ridden home and after the younger children were in bed, Ada sat with Evelyn in the kitchen in the comfortable parallel quiet they'd built between them over months. The lamp was low. The fire was banked. Ada had a cup of tea that she held in both hands. Can I ask you something? Ada said. Yes. When you came here, at the beginning, did you think you were going to stay? Evelyn thought about the honest version of this. No, she said. But you did. I did. Ada looked at her tea. Why? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. This girl who had been managing everything for so long, who had installed herself as Evelyn's shadow because she needed someone to shadow and hadn't been able to admit that, who was 14 now and would be 15 and 16 and eventually would leave this house and build something of her own somewhere, and who deserved an honest answer to an honest question. Because leaving felt like the wrong thing, Evelyn said. Not impractical or difficult, wrong. And I've learned to pay attention to that particular feeling. Ada considered this. Even though you'd only been here a week? Sometimes you know things faster than you can explain them. She paused. The explanation comes later. The knowing comes first. Ada nodded slowly. She drank her tea. The kitchen was quiet. I'm glad you stayed, Ada said, simply, without decoration. So am I, Evelyn said. They sat there together until the lamp needed tending, and then they tended it, and then they went to bed. The thing about a place, Evelyn had come to understand, was that it became itself through the accumulated weight of what happened in it. A house was not a building, it was a history. Every meal and argument and repaired fence and child's fever and awkward conversation and moment of unexpected ease, all of it layered into the walls and the floors and the air of a place until the place was no longer separate from the lives being lived inside it. You couldn't always see it happening. You could only see it after enough time had passed. The Mercer Ranch, in the spring of its 8th month with Evelyn in it, was not a different place in its landscape. The ridge was the same. The cottonwoods were where they had always been. The hills went on to the same horizon they had always gone to. The clapboard house was still the gray of old dishwater except where Henry had spent a Saturday in March repainting the front door red, which was his own idea and which nobody had suggested and which had somehow changed the face of the whole house in a way that a single painted door had no right to do. But it was different inside. Not perfectly. Nothing was perfect, and the summer ahead would bring its own difficulties, another mortgage payment, and a drought that the farmers in the county were already concerned about, and a section of the barn roof that would need replacing before fall. Life on a frontier ranch did not arrive at a destination and stop. It just kept going, which was either the hardest thing about it or the best thing about it, and probably both. But it was different in the ways that mattered. Silas was repairing the south pasture gate on a Saturday afternoon in early May when Evelyn brought him water, which she did not usually do because he had legs and knew where the pump was, but she had been inside all morning and wanted to be outside for a few minutes in the spring air with its smell of new grass and turned earth. She sat on the fence rail while he worked, and they were quiet together the way they had gotten to be quiet together. Not the quiet of two people avoiding something, but the quiet of two people who had enough history between them that silence was not empty anymore. After a while, he said, without looking up from the gate hinge he was working on, "Henry wants to take on the east section this summer." "The new grazing section?" "He's been looking at it, working out what it would need." He tested the hinge. "He's right about most of it." "He usually is," Evelyn said. "I was thinking about putting him in charge of it, his project. He manages it, he keeps the records, he reports to me." He paused. "He's 12. "He's been 12 for a while," Evelyn said. Silas looked up at her. The spring light was on his face, and he was squinting slightly against it, and he had a smear of grease on his jaw from the hinge work. "You think it's a good idea?" "I think if you give him real responsibility and real trust, he'll give you real results. And I think if you keep managing it for him because he's 12, he'll be 12 about it." Silas was quiet a moment, looking at the hinge. Then, "Ellen used to say something like that?" "She was right," Evelyn said. He worked the hinge. She sat on the fence rail and watched the hills. Somewhere across the yard, she could hear Samuel talking to the chickens, a one-sided, earnest monologue that she couldn't make out the words of, but that had the rhythm of someone delivering important information to a difficult audience. "He's been talking more," Silas said. He meant Samuel. He didn't look up when he said it. "Yes. A lot more." A pause. "He told me yesterday that Harriet's behavior is getting worse, and he thinks she needs a consequence." "She does," Evelyn said. She pecked Clara again. Silas was quiet for another moment. When he spoke, his voice had a quality she'd heard in it only occasionally. Not the contained quality or the managed quality, but something underneath both of those that was older and more unguarded. "For a long time," he said. I was afraid he might just keep getting quieter, that it might become permanent, that he'd lost whatever it was that made him." He stopped. The hinge got another adjustment it didn't strictly need. "I didn't know how to help him." "You couldn't help him," Evelyn said. "You were grieving the same thing he was." "I know that now." He set down the wrench. "I didn't know it then. I just knew I was failing him." She looked at this man, the calloused hands and the healed cut and the shoulder that was still occasionally stiff and the gray rain eyes and the red-painted door that had been Henry's idea but that Silas had helped with for 3 hours on a March Saturday without being asked. She thought about what Ada had said. He's better when someone does that. She thought about all the ways that was true and all the ways that it was also incomplete, because Silas Mercer did not become better because of what someone else did to him. He became better because he allowed it, which was its own kind of courage, maybe the harder kind. "You didn't fail him," she said. "You were there. That matters more than you think." He looked at her for a moment with that expression, the one that was almost something, that got most of the way to wherever it was going and then stopped just short. She had learned that this was simply who he was, that the almost expression was not a withholding but a limitation of the medium, like a man who had the words in one language but could only get most of them across in another. She had learned to read the almost. "I know what you're not saying," she told him. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." She got down from the fence rail. "Come inside when you're done. Clara made something in the kitchen that she won't tell me what it is, which means it's either going to be very good or require significant cleanup." He almost smiled. The full version was almost there. "I'll be in by 4. She walked back across the yard. Samuel broke off his lecture to the chickens long enough to fall into step beside her for a few paces, then peeled off toward the barn for reasons she didn't ask about. She went up the porch steps and through the front door with its red paint bright in the afternoon light and into the house. There are things you can plan for and things you cannot. Evelyn had understood this her whole life, but had understood it differently at different points in that life. As a child, she had understood it as injustice. Why should some things be plannable and others not? Why should hard work not be sufficient protection against loss? As a young woman, she had understood it as risk management. Identify what you could control, minimize the rest, be prepared to absorb what got through. After her mother died, she had understood it as something that didn't have a clean name, something in the vicinity of acceptance without resignation. The understanding that the unplannable was not the enemy and was sometimes the thing that put you exactly where you needed to be. She had not planned to come to Ridgeline County and find 4 children and a man and a failing ranch that needed her particular set of capabilities at that particular moment. She had answered an advertisement. She had dragged a trunk up a hill. She had looked at the house and the mud and the broken fence and the yellow dog, and she had kept walking because the alternatives were worse. The rest of it had been choice, hers and Silas's and the children's, in the ways children make choices. Not always consciously, not always in language, but in the way Samuel had put his hand on her knee in the dark kitchen, in the way Henry had pressed his shoulder against hers at the wagon wheel outside the courthouse, in the way Ada said, "I'm glad you stayed simply and without decoration. Families were not found. Families. They were built daily in the ordinary accumulation of meals and arguments and repaired fences and imperfect cakes with unlevel layers. They were built in the decision to stay past the first week, in the decision to stay past the first month, and all the subsequent decisions that followed, each one smaller and less dramatic than the one before it, because that was how building worked. The first decision was the hardest, and then the thing you were building held some of its own weight, and each decision after that was easier. Not because the commitment was smaller, but because it was more established. She had not been looking for a family. She had been moving, which was the desperate version of not stopping. And the place she had been moving had turned out to be somewhere worth stopping. On a Sunday in late May, Evelyn was in the parlor with her mending when Clara came in and sat down in the chair by the window. The same chair she had sat in that first time, the afternoon she had corrected Evelyn's stitches and said she taught me. Clara was 9 now, almost 10, and the closed-off quality she'd had in the early months had not disappeared entirely. It was part of her, woven into who she was, the particular careful quality of a child who had learned early that love was not a permanent condition. But it was not the armor it had been. It was just a trait, like her father's jaw and her mother's stitchwork and her own careful, observing eyes. She sat for a while without saying anything. Then, "When I grow up, I want to have a house," she said. Not to Evelyn specifically, more to the air in front of her, the way children said things they'd been thinking about. A real one, not just a place, but a house where people stay. Evelyn kept her mending. "Where people stay?" she said. "Where it's the same people every morning? You know where everyone is." Clara looked at her hands. "Mama used to say that was the most important thing. Not what the house looked like, whether people stayed in it." "She was right," Evelyn said. Clara looked at her sideways. "Did you know you were going to stay when you first came?" It was the same question Ada had asked differently, from a different angle, which was how Clara always approached things, not directly but by circling, finding the edge of a thing before committing to looking at its center. "No," Evelyn said. "I came for a week." "Why did you stay longer?" Evelyn set down her mending. She looked at this girl, 9 years old, careful eyes, her mother's stitches in her hands, the weight of loss carried lightly enough now that it was just part of the load rather than all of it. "Because you showed me how to do a stitch properly," she said, "and I figured anyone who could teach me something on the 4th day was probably worth knowing for longer than a week." Clara looked at her. Something in her face shifted, not into a smile exactly, but into the recognizable vicinity of one, a Clara smile, which was quieter and more private than most people's, and meant proportionally more. "That's a silly reason," she said. "Maybe," Evelyn said. "It worked." Clara turned back to the window. The Maylight came through the glass and lay across the floor between them, and outside the yard was green from the spring rains, and the cottonwoods along the track were in full leaf, and Samuel could be heard somewhere near the coop, engaged in his ongoing supervisory relationship with Harriet the hen. The house was full of ordinary sound. Henry, somewhere upstairs, moving around with the purposeful heaviness of a boy who had grown 2 inches since November. Ada's voice in the kitchen talking to someone, probably herself, which she did when she was working through a problem. Silas's boots on the porch steps as he came in from the afternoon's work. The yellow dog, whose name turned out to be Frank, was asleep in the hallway, which he was technically not allowed to be, which everyone ignored. This was the house, not the building. The building was still old and gray painted except for the red door, still mortgaged, still drafty in the north-facing rooms in January, still requiring more work in any given month than one person could complete. But the house, the thing that word actually meant, the human fact of a place where people returned at the end of the day and knew who else was going to be there, that was this. This sound and this light, and this particular Sunday in May with all its people in it. Evelyn picked up her mending. She had come with $12.40 and a want ad, and the recent wound of a loss she hadn't known how to stand still near. She was leaving that woman behind in the only way that mattered. Not by forgetting her or rejecting her, but by having become someone built on top of her, the way you built on any foundation. The grief was still there. It would always be there, which was its own kind of keeping. But it was underneath now, load-bearing, doing the structural work that grief did when you let it. She thought about what she might tell someone, if someone asked, not the facts of it, which were simple enough, but the truth of it, which was harder to say cleanly. She would say, the things you need are not always the things you think you're looking for. She would say, a family is not a fact you find. It is a thing you make, imperfectly, daily, without guarantee. She would say, showing up when you said you would is not a small thing. It is, in the end, most of the thing. She would say, sometimes you drag your trunk up a hill, and you look at a broken house and you keep walking, and it turns out that the keeping walking was the answer to a question you didn't know you were asking. From the kitchen came the smell of whatever Clara had made the day before, warming back up. It had turned out to be a very adequate spice cake, no cleanup required. From upstairs came Henry's footsteps and then his voice calling something down to Ada. From outside came Samuel's ongoing monologue and the sound of chickens registering an opinion on it. From the porch came Silas's boots being knocked against the step the way he always did before coming inside, the small, reliable sound of a man returning. The door opened. "Anyone home?" he said, a question that required no answer and was not really a question, just the thing he said when he came in, the verbal equivalent of the stamp of boots on the step, the daily sound of the same person coming back to the same place. "In here!" Evelyn called. He came through. He looked in at the parlor, at Clara by the window, at Evelyn with her mending, at the afternoon light on the floor, and he nodded once in the way he nodded at things that were as they should be, and went on to the kitchen. Clara looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at her mending. Outside, the ridge country went on in its enormous, unhurried way, the hills and the sky and the long distances, and inside the house held its people, all of them accounted for, all of them home. That was enough. That had always been enough. It had only taken showing up to find out.